Hello there guys and welcome back to the channel. Right, so far I have done two class breakdowns and the classes being skill and tech. Today we're going to be talking about Mystic class. Right, Mystic class used to be by far the smallest class in the game, and surprise surprise, even though they have received 11 champion additions in 2008, 2019 and 2020, which is most of any other class, they are still the smallest class in the game, sharing this honor with science class right here. Right, so let me just jump to the other corner. We're going to be using Auntmay's website once again, and a few interesting stats about Mystic class. So as I said, they are the smallest class in the game, 30 champions, sharing that with science. Now, out of those 30 champions, I believe 16 are hero champions, 12 are villains, and 2 are without tag. Now, the reason why they are without tag in Ebony's Maw case is obviously because there was this whole Thanos Corp thing introduced, and Symbiote Supreme doesn't seem to be a villain, doesn't seem to be a hero, he is a symbiote. Right, so these are the two non-tagged Mystic champions. Now, in total, in the class, there are 7 bleed immune champions, so overall they do have a fair amount of bleed immunity going around, even though several of those bleed immune champions are quite severely outdated and not practically viable. And then we only have we have 3 poison immune champions, which is even worse. And then we have no shock immunities, and we have hardly any cold snap immunities, 2 of them being Mephisto and Sasquatch, which is kind of cold snap immune. But either way, so it is safe to say that immunities by themselves is not really the strong side of Mystic class, and it's actually one of the downfalls of Mystic champions in general that I'm going to talk about a bit later. As I mentioned, Mystic class used to be extremely tiny and extremely outdated and largely considered to be the weakest class in the game up until the end of 2018, maybe in 2019. Now, initially, obviously, pre-12.0 Scarlet Witch and Doctor Strange carried the Mystic class, but slowly but surely over the course of these years, Mystic class got completely outdated and everybody looked at Mystic Champions as this unloved puppy. But 2019, 2020, we have had 11 champions added to Mystic class, and the vast majority of them are actually very fun, usable, interesting, and cool champions, with the possible exceptions of Diablo and Ebony Maw, who are, well, pretty much memes in the game. But the rest of the champions are actually quite powerful, and each of them offers something interesting, something unique, or something very exciting and fun. So Mystic class is no longer considered to be the weakest class in the game by a long shot, and they seem to be doing better and better each year, pretty much. Now, there are several changes happening within the Mystic class, but one thing that is quite obvious, that Mystic class also has the most OP class-based mastery that we have available, Mystic Dispersion. Fun fact, Mystic Dispersion is actually in its current form already nerfed, because previously Mystic Dispersion used to trigger whenever buffs were replaced, and that basically enabled you to gain a lot more power in different scenarios. But it also had a really annoying interaction with dexterity, where every time you dexed, you used to trigger Mystic Dispersion. And for that reason, there was a period of time in the game that was called Mystic Wars, where pretty much 80% of the defenders people were placing were Mystic champions, and defender diversity wasn't a thing, just because of how powerful Mystic Dispersion was. It wasn't as much even about the champions themselves, it was just the fact that you consistently ended up eating level 3s to your face. Blade changed that, and that kind of started the downfall of Mystic class, and we're gonna touch again to downfall of Mystic class and the weaknesses of Mystic class in general a bit later in the video. But first, we do need to go over the strong sides, kind of like the most characteristic abilities Mystic class possess. And whenever you mention a Mystic champion in general, the first thing that you definitely do think about is buff control. In fact, every single champion in Mystic class, as far as I could notice, has some sort of form how to deal with buffs or interact with opponents' buffs. Even the older ones like Juggernaut and Iron Fist have some sort of staggers or nullifications, but that is pretty much one of the key aspects. Every single Mystic champion is affected by opponents having buffs, even if you can't directly nullify them. Let's say Dragonman gains additional bonuses if opponents have active buffs, then we obviously have all the nullification abilities. Sasquatch gains more power if opponent has more buffs, so on and so forth. So Mystic class entirely depends on opponents having buffs, and that by definition is not ideal in every single scenario, but nonetheless, that is the thing that Mystic class specializes in, and obviously it interacts extremely well with Mystic Dispersion as a mastery. Right, now the second thing that lately Kabam has been moving away from and giving this role more to Tech class. However, still about 50% of Mystic champions have some sort of abilities that interact with opponent's power bar and power meter. Black Widow Clairvoyant has power drain, Dr. Doom has excellent power control, Dr. Voodoo has power control, Dormammu is one of the most kind of like OP power control mechanics, too bad the rest of the champions suck so much. Jaggerman reduce opponent's power past 2 bars of power, Ebony Maw has power drain on heavy attacks, Ghost Rider has power drain on level 2, and Fate Seal and Power Seal on level 3. So on and so forth. So over 50% of Mystic class also can be used for power control. And it actually synergizes extremely well with buff control, because frequently power gain is in a form of an active buff. So you can not only control opponent's power bar, but also neutralize or prevent opponents from gaining the power gain effects. But yes, typically power control still is largely looked at for Mystics for most part, and they seem to be the most effective power controllers in the game, like Magic, like Dr. Doom. Now, don't get me wrong, Tech class has its upsides as well, but it's often more conditional, and most of the time when you're strictly looking for power control, I believe Magic and Dr. Doom is where your sights will be set towards. But as I said, that seems to be shifting currently in the game with the new design of Mystic characters and Tech characters, kind of like swapping those roles around. And the third strong side of Mystic class in general, well, you can go with two different things. One, low-key, there is actually a large amount of Mystic champions who have access to Unstoppable, and that also seems to be fairly characteristic buff, especially most recently. So they are moving away from giving Mystic champions power control, and they are moving into the direction of giving more Mystic champions unstoppable effects. Obviously, that is still being helped by some of the old guard champions like Unstoppable Colossus and Juggernaut, but in general, even Dr. Doom's aura has like an aspect of unstoppability there. And then obviously we do have Dragon Man, Sasquatch can go unstoppable, Mojo has a synergy that lets him be an unstoppable machine, Man-Thing triggers unstoppable, Mangog unstoppable. So that seems to be more and more common trend within Mystic champions. But the real strong side, the real third strong point, I think that most people associate with Mystic champions, and that goes in form of, for lack of better term, shenanigans. Because Mystic champions are relatively balanced in matchups where opponents have few buffs and somewhat typically underpowered or at the disadvantage if opponents gain no buffs. However, in any given matchup where opponent has plethora of buffs, Mystic champions can go absolutely wild and do some filthy damage and make some crazy numbers and just absolutely destroy some fights. And that goes for a very significant portion of Mystic champions. We have all seen Longshot completely melt Act 6 opponents in a single level 2 on resistor path. Mojo can do some insane cool things against like Angelas and Agans and things like that. And then we have Mordo, who can abuse opponents having too many buffs by doing insane damage over time. Obviously, Morningstar, insane level 2 burst damage. Magic, insane level 3 burst damage. And the list goes on. Even Sorcerer Supreme, in any matchup where opponent gains a lot of buffs, she can stack, 20 armor breaks and hit for some filthy numbers. And that is kind of like one of the things about Mystic class. A lot of their kit and a lot of their abilities are based around Mystic Dispersion, and that is kind of like their strong point and also their downfall in many situations. But when it works, Mystic class can appear to be the most broken OP thing in the game, but obviously that doesn't quite work in every scenario, which is why we are moving on to weaknesses. And one of the biggest weaknesses of Mystic class is they have little to no, let's say, casual questing champions. And what I mean by casual questing champions, I mean the champions that you would take in any given vanilla fight. Now, yes, recently they have been doing a bit better with it, where technically perhaps you want to use Longshot for some questing, but still, if opponent doesn't have buffs, don't really kind of look at Longshot as often. Then we have Mojo, who's probably the closest thing, if you're not counting old outdated Guillotine and Iron Fists and things like that, comes to a casual questing champion in Mystic class, because Mojo, once ramped up, can do a lot of damage by giving his own buffs to the opponent, and perhaps similarly to Man-Thing, even though Man-Thing isn't quite up there, the strength-wise. But the general idea is, whenever you go questing, whenever there is a random quest and you do not know exactly what you're going to face, Mystic class has pretty much no champions that you will bring in just against your average everyday random opponent. They're specialists, but they're relatively weak in generic circumstances. Like every other classes have some champions that you know for a fact can finish out fights fast, and relatively broad reach against who they can do that. Like Cosmic class has obviously Corvus, Captain Marvel movie, Cosmic Ghost Rider, perfect questing champions. Tech class is Ghost and Hulkbuster or whatever, great questing champions. Now we have Science class, who also has plenty of champions that you can just randomly bring in and have fun and use the champions well. Mystic doesn't really have that. Mystic always sits kind of like on the bench or on the roster just for when you need them, but they are not very broad. They're kind of a class that has horse blinders on, and they just do the thing that they do and don't do much else, if anything else. And that unfortunately leads me to the second point of weakness, that they have limited uses in like real troublesome fights and questing conditions, because they are easily soft countered as a consequence to any relatively nasty node. Mystic class is very, very, very dependent on access to special attacks, for instance. So any node that messes with your power gain really does hinder majority of the Mystic champions. The fact that Mystic class does not really have many immune champions and no abilities or way to deal with any damage or time effect or debuffs, again, automatically kind of like discount them from being valuable or good options for a ton of fights immediately. And that is unfortunately a thing that Mystic class definitely suffers. I get a feeling that in many instances they just kind of get, let's say, soft countered by as afterthought, by a side effect, even though it wasn't necessarily designed to counter Mystic champions. And the final point against Mystic class is that for whatever reason, Kabam seems to have the biggest grudge against Mystic champions, and they are also the class that is most hard countered. As in, like, pretty much no other class have a champion to face them like Human Torch. Like, if you bring in Mystic champions against Human Torch, like, you're pretty much dead by default. So you just cannot do it. And then there is Blade, who can gain Danger Sense against all Mystic champions specifically. And then we have Red Hulk, who is significantly more potent and ramps up quicker against Mystic champions. And then we have Yellow Jacket, who places Power Stings upon the activation of his level 1, even if you evade that level 1, so on and so forth. So there are a ton of champions, but most notably Human Torch, where if you have to use, let's say, 5 Mystic champions, all opponent has to do is put on Human Torch opposite to you, and you're pretty much gonna get wrecked. And that is one of the downfalls and one of the weak sides overall of Mystic class. They're the class that is most heavily hard countered, and they are also the class that has a lot of soft counters, because as soon as you mess about with power and power bars, Mystic class just falls apart. Soon as you mess about ability to use special attacks, Mystic class often falls apart. And yeah, there is just a lot that can go wrong with a Mystic champion. And last but not least, one of the weaker sides for Mystic class is the fact that the class at large is extremely, extremely suicide unfriendly. Again, largely caused by the fact that there are hardly any immune champions, and complemented by the fact that they are so dependent on power and special attacks that there are very, very few champions who can support suicide masteries well. Diablo can do it, but Diablo sucks. Obviously, then there is a famous Black Widow Clairvoyant, who is like the ultimate Mystic weapon when it comes to running it with suicides, and perhaps to a degree Dragon Man. But Dragon Man isn't really a typical Mystic champion either, so I don't think it really counts, because you're not going to use him where you would want the classic Mystic abilities. And other than that, yes, suicides really are not happy with Mystic class, let's say. So those are the weak points of Mystics. And overall, for the class, I do feel that they are unfortunately being held back by Mystic Dispersion. Don't get me wrong, Mystic Dispersion is an awesome mastery, but it has definitely impacted the way the class is built. It has also impacted what kind of abilities designers can give to Mystic champions for them not to be too powerful. And I am not sure at this point whether that is a good thing, because Mystic class, I think, in the terms of their ability set and what they can do and what they can do well, is probably the most narrow class in the game overall. And unfortunately, I don't think it's going to change. Mystic class champions in general are specialists in the things that they do well, and they're fairly rubbish in generic circumstances outside of those fights. Couple of notable MVPs. Obviously, the top Mystic champion is Dr. Doom. The entire class is subservient to the Latvian ruler, and he is by far the best Mystic champion in general overall. And there are a lot of people who obviously prefer Black Widow Clairvoyant if you are frequently running Suicide Masteries. But the way I personally value Dr. Doom more is that Dr. Doom without Suicide Masteries is better than Black Widow Clairvoyant with Suicide Masteries. Therefore, overall, I think Dr. Doom is a better champion. But it is extremely useful to have both of them because, yeah, they complement each other extremely well for whatever mastery setup you're running, and also each have kind of unique aspects to them. Like Black Widow Clairvoyant has a great amount of immunities. She can have 3 different immunities based on, well, whichever curse you're in, and she can access a lot more damage over time effects. But Dr. Doom has a lot more potent power control and the sturdiness and tankiness in his playstyle. Now, other than that, definitely the most notable Mystic champions would be Sorcerer Supreme, who is also quite unique with her ability to take damage in block. Then we have Dragon Man, who's cool. Then we have Magic, who is still one of the Alliance War MVPs and is the best champion at completely shutting down opponent's power bar. And yeah, there are a very large amount of good Mystic champions, and some of the ones that I mentioned are on top, but that doesn't mean that Longshot, that doesn't mean that Mojo, that doesn't mean that, who else? Tigra. Tigra is the most unique champion, by the way. Tigra is this, and an additional point that I wanted to mention, because Tigra has an extremely high skill cap, and I'm still learning her, but I definitely am starting to see more and more of her potential. And what I like about Tigra is because she's also very different. Just like Ghost is very different from an average tech champion, Tigra is very, very different from an average Mystic champion, which I absolutely love, and I definitely want to spend more time learning her. Additionally, as I said, Mystic class has tons of different type of buff control, and the best thing you can do for yourself is to realize that there is a difference between Nullify, between Stagger, between Fate Seal, and most importantly, it's very also important to realize that Black Widow, Clairvoyance, buff immunity bypasses all of that. So when champions are immune to Nullify, when champions are immune to Stagger and things like that, Black Widow Clairvoyance buff immunity will still work because it's technically none of these things. And that's last tidbit of tip, I suppose, that I can give to you guys. But yeah, that is it for this video. So 3 classes broken down, 3 left to go. I hope you guys have enjoyed the videos thus far, and yeah, I'm gonna be back soon with the next class breakdown. See ya. Hello there guys, and welcome back to the channel. So we have all the information about